What about the Aubrey de Grey way? Say, skip the uploading of the human brain, but accomplishing immortality, or even if what he calls longevity escape velocity, a moment in which every 10 years we'll be able to move death or life expectancy by another 10 years.
I'd sign up for that in a shot.
So wouldn't that change the human condition?
Yes, it will, and I'd like to tiptoe around that question because it's my plans for the third novel that I've still got to do on my stack, which I won't be starting until the earliest this time next year. I'm still making notes for it.
Excellent. That's one of the issues I'll bring back towards the end of our interview. But perhaps now is the time to come to the meat of the questions here, or one of the most interesting questions that I've been dying to ask you. Now, Accelerando, when I read Accelerando, it was a profound book to me. I did it 5 or 6 years ago, and it really impressed me. To the degree that it's in a way responsible for me starting Singularity weblog. Thus, I was very surprised, to say the least, when in your first original email you shared with me the following: please don't forget that I wrote this book a few years ago, and lately I'm more of a Singularity skeptic than I was when I wrote the book. Now, both me and Werner Vinge are dying to find out why. What has changed in the last few years since you wrote that book?
Well, let's rewind a bit and see where the book's roots lie. Back around 1991 to 1993, I was fairly active on a mailing list, the Extropians mailing list. Not at its current home, but an earlier incarnation of it. Actually, that's where I first ran across Ken MacLeod. We were both on the mailing list at the same time, sometime before I actually met him physically and after I'd moved to Edinburgh. Anyway, I was on it because it really gave me a sense of wonder kick for the idea load in SF, because an awful lot of science fictional structures have been appeared to have been stagnating since the mid to late 1980s. There wasn't visibly much progress in it until I ran across a parallel field in which people were speculating about the future in completely different terms. Now, let's hold with that. In 1989 to 1990, I decided I'd made a career blunder and went back to university to study computer science, which means I've got the equivalent of a 1932 aerospace engineering degree. In the 90s, I was working in the computer industry, and as one does, I ended up working for a web startup in 1995, then doing freelance work and signing on with a .com in 1997 as their first programming hire. I was a contractor at a company called DataCash, payment service company, which doesn't exist anymore because it achieved nirvana. It was taken over by MasterCard. Anyway, from 1997 onwards, I was writing software to basically handle the problem of interfacing web servers in the UK to the British banking system to process credit card transactions. And it works in a completely different way to the Visa and MasterCard network in North America. And we were having a spot of bother in 1998 to 1999 with growth during the first .com boom. We were experiencing 30% compound growth per month for 9 consecutive months.
Wow.
I was the guy who was writing the servers that handled this workload, and what had originally been written as a demo was sold out from under me by the CEO who wanted to sell a product, and the result was I was having to run like crazy to add features and patch bugs the whole time. Now, the Tim Berners-Lee, who pretty much invented the World Wide Web, quipped circa 1996 that the web experienced 5 years of development time for every 12 months on the wall clock. And he wasn't wrong. It felt like you were living through a year every 2.5 months. And I was driven pretty close to a nervous breakdown by the demands of just keeping up with this, because we were basically on the exponential upslope. The company went from, I think, initial seed corn capital of approximately £30,000 or about $50,000 to a reverse takeover going public, which with a valuation of roughly £36 million in just under 3 years.
Wow.
which is a fairly scary growth rate to be in the middle of. I nearly cracked up under the pressure. Only instead I wrote Lobsters because it was sort of think in terms of an oyster. It's got an irritant sand grain, so it puts a layer of lacquer around it to insulate itself. Lobsters was basically me trying to write a story to externalize my sense of, I guess, bewildered pace of change. And I sort of finished it in early 1999 in my copious spare time. Sent it to a friend of mine who's these days a full-time computer journalist, was a computer journalist then. He started out as the engineer who bolted together one of the UK's earlier ISPs. And he read it and he said, "Charlie, this is really great, but you'll never sell it. The audience would have had to have overdosed on Slashdot for 6 months before they understood it." We both have Slashdot ID numbers in triple or early quadruple digits. And he was absolutely right. He just underestimated how many people would end up reading Slashdot. Now, at that time, I was trying to break into the American market with fiction because fundamentally, if you want to make money writing science fiction, you go where the money is, and that's the North American market. Sorry, I have a critic.
Or the intelligence that pulls the strings behind the curtain.
Clearly.
Let's not reveal the end of the story here.
Yeah. Anyway, I was trying to break into Asimov's SF magazine and sent Gardner Dozois a copy of Lobsters, and he bought it and published it. And the story sort of was left hanging at the end, and it occurred to me that Manfred's story hadn't been finished there. So I began writing a second story set a few years later to deal with a messy divorce. And halfway through that story, I suddenly realized what I was trying to do, or where I needed to go. Because I was still in the .com, in the process of IPOing at that point. And what I suddenly realized was there was a received wisdom around late 1999, early 2000, that it is impossible to write about the Singularity itself. You can set stories after it, or you can write about the run-up to it, but you can't write through it. And I had this mad attack of hubris and thought, well, why don't I? At which point I got this idea of a repeating triple structure, 3 acts, which is a classic staple of drama to begin with, 3 generations, each members of a post-human family, as it were, 3 different generations. They're so different they might as well be members of different species. Each of them gets 3 stories to sort of show how things develop, and it shows the run-up to the moment of and the aftermath of a singularity. And the moment of singularity in Accelerando happens in the middle of, I think it's the 5th story, where a bunch of people are sort of sitting in a pub having a debate over when the singularity happened. And somebody said it happened in 1967, and somebody else says, 12,000 BC, and somebody else says, 2018. Somebody else said it hasn't happened yet. And the joke is they're all sitting around in an upload environment on board a starship, simultaneous with the singularity actually happening back home. There's a meta framework around Accelerando that most people don't seem to get, which is the role of Einako, the cat. Einako is not a cat. Einako, if you're reading the book closely, changes sex from each chapter, from one chapter to another, changes body plan, spends one chapter as a city rather than a cat. Einako is not a cat. Einako is actually a strongly superhuman AI who has discovered that humans are much easier to manipulate when you pose as a small furry glove puppet. Human beings have a natural inclination to be afraid of big, scary superhuman AIs. They're much less paranoid about cats.
What's the name of your cat, by the way?
Oh, this one is Frigg, after the Norse goddess.
So we're sure it's not Einako.
We're pretty different name. Also, she's a real cat. I have to clean out the litter tray regularly enough to prove that one.
Okay.
Anyway, by the end of Accelerando, the last story is basically about Eineko's theory of mind. Eineko has a theory of mind sufficiently strong to actually simulate an entire human consciousness accurately within it. The human beings we're dealing with, including our viewpoint characters, are actually simulations within Eineko's mind who are finally set free at the end. In fact, there's some question as to whether all their memories are actually accurate. We have a serious unreliable narrator problem in this novel, which is something I had fun with in subsequent books.
Okay, so what happened after that to make you skeptical about the potentiality of the singularity as a high probability in our near or far off future then?
Well, bear in mind I was writing Accelerando between late 1998 and 2004. In the middle of that patch, Y2K happened. Now, looking around at the world around us, an awful lot of people set their sights on that particular 000 year. And it wasn't just the techies, it wasn't just the geeks. You'll also have noticed an amazing upwelling of religious fundamentalist millenarianism. Now, it turns out that this isn't unique. Years with significant dates in them have an ability to fascinate and obsess human beings who should bloody well know better that these dating systems are entirely arbitrary. Happened in the year 1000, actually between the year 990 AD and roughly 1032 AD. There were these waves of religious believers wandering all over Europe, basically throwing away all their possessions, throwing away their clothing, having free love, convinced Jesus was coming to rescue them. And the rapture was, well, not the rapture, they hadn't, that particular belief structure is a new construct that came out of the late 19th, early 20th century, but convinced the second coming was about to descend on them. Move forward, and from the 1990s onwards, you have a similar wave of Christian millenarianist belief. We've still got it today. The recent announcement by an American preacher that the rapture was due on, was it May the 18th or May the 22nd?
I think the name was Harold Campings, and I think it was the 21st.
Yeah, he's revised his estimate. It's late in October now, but I'm willing to bet it's not going to happen. Now, looking at the psychological roots of the whole thing, I'm inclined to ask, to what extent is the post-humanist anticipation of a singularity a dangerous psychological blind spot where we're recycling the apocalyptic imagery that is embedded at a very low level in the firmware of a civilization we live in? Because modern Western civilization and post-Enlightenment civilization and the scientific method all sprang, if you go back far enough, a couple of 200-300 years, they came out of the Protestant Reformation. They came out of attempts to find a better way of relating to the world. And, the whole idea of continual improvement of the human condition is something deeply rooted in Protestant religious faith. Now, that doesn't mean I'm ruling out any possibility of a singularity. It's just, I think it's wise to be skeptical and be rather cautious in evaluating why you might believe in such a rupture in the human condition and how things could change so rapidly.